It's another manly Monday, and I am tempted to go just another manly Monday, but I don't own that music, and that's cheesy, and I am just avoiding talking about what I decided to talk about today, because I will admit two things. One, the whole concept of toxic masculinity in isolation really makes me uncomfortable and I don't like it. And two, I have been a sheeple and used the term anyway in the past because I was trying to go along to get along. And those rare occasions that I just try to go with the crowd. And Leanna is not her best Leanna when she conforms. And so now I regret that. So yeah, you will find history of me using the term toxic masculinity as, a shorthand of sorts. I renounce that. I've been doing a lot of thinking about this whole concept, and why it in and of itself is toxic victim blaming that I think actually reinforces the concept of toxic masculinity because of the way it's talked about. That probably sounded circular, but this is the way Leanna's brain thinks. Leanna's brain is highly analytical and systemized, but it doesn't move in nice straight lines. It goes wee like a Celtic knot, and there's a beginning and an end, and it all flows in a chain, but it goes all over the place and drops off at some interesting places. So this is where we get to the help support this channel part. Help support this channel, become a monthly patron, patreon.com/Leanna K. Patron support is very, very important, not only because of the money's good, but also the front of the line thing about where this channel goes, what we talk about. That feedback from people who are willing to put money down is very, very important. But you can also do a very, very important one-time Leanna Care session for someone who can use it but can't afford it. Coffee.com/Leanna K. The whole one-time thing has been working out really, really well. Very appreciative to the people that keep buying sessions for people. I guess they like the idea of it, but it's nice to have that ability to do a one-time donation. Anyway, avoiding as well. Okay. Big topic, right? So let me start with a metaphor that may or may not make sense. My attitude about toxic masculinity is that toxic masculinity is just generally shitty human behavior with a masculine coat of paint on it. And there are a lot of things women do that hurt us in the short, medium, and long term, but we don't talk about toxic femininity the same way we talk about toxic masculinity. We talk about it as patriarchy and the impacts of patriarchy. And the issue I have with that, I think you can see what's coming, is that everything is men's fault no matter what. But what does that mean? That means that the entire model presupposes that women aren't whole people with whole accountability for our actions and behaviors. And it's funny because one of the things that these toxic masculinity tests measure is anger. And just because somebody's angry every day or a lot or is prone to anger doesn't mean they don't have reasons to be angry. And the other problem with toxic masculinity theory is, again, because it's a subset of general human shittiness, it's like trying to figure out what an elephant is by only looking at the trunk. I don't know if you've ever heard that metaphor before. I like it. One, because I like elephants. Two, because elephant trunks are so weird. Anyway, I'm dissociating again because I hate this topic. And this is why I'm talking about it, because certain things I am in a unique position to talk about. One, because I am a woman, so I'm not going to get accused of manosphere shit the same way. Two, because I am profoundly gender nonconforming. And so with this stuff, I'm able to step back and look at this whole thing without being in one sphere or the other. Now that I have gotten over my self-blame, or mostly gotten over my self-blame and shame for not conforming. It's a very freeing thing. And ironically, part of the reason I'm much more comfortable talking about this now is because, I did the hyper feminine pinup art cosplay thing. I explore that space and realize how much of that is performance instead of, inner identity. But then I do the, the dude stuff. I mean, look at my background, right? The stuff I like isn't traditional girly stuff, to the point that whenever there is something I like that's really girly, people tend to find that amusing and kind of cute that, oh, Leanna finally likes a girly thing. It is rare, but it's just because it is so hardwired girl. Whereas because this whole, gendered toys, boys' toys are more boys' toys with a side thing for girls, whereas girls' toys are just straight up girls, right? Like, it is just all in girls because of the assumption that some girls may want to play with boys' toys, but no boy is going to want to play with girls' toys. And that's an assumption we just can't make, right? But we do. Because it's all about bypassing the parents. And that's when the whole I just call it generally toxic gendered thinking instead of toxic masculinity. But then I stop myself and go, is it really that? Because then somebody whose thinking is gendered, someone whose gender identity is either straight up transgender or straight up cisgender, well, that's suggesting there's something wrong with that state too, right? You see how when you start using formal logic to break this shit down, the problems become evident with just going toxic masculinity. And then, I have to watch my own bias, which, I am a reformed social constructionist because I had, and this is the problem with only having your point of view on things and not listening to other people's point of view, because I have no awareness of what it's like to feel male or feel female. I just assumed, well, it's all performance, it's all expression, it's all social construct. But then I talk to people and I really listen to them, and it's not. And I've heard this not only from, individuals saying, no, it's real to feel this way. It's like, all right. Is it cool? Like, what's it like? And my attitude to it, I don't need proof. I don't need proof that this is a thing. I don't need proof China exists, even though I've never been there, right? But also, PhDs in psychology have told me that, no, gender identity is a very, very real thing. Okay, fine. And this is where I get to what I've heard a lot of men say they have issues with toxic masculinity, in that it suggests that masculinity in itself is toxic, which is not the intent. And for a long time, I tried to explain that's not the intent. And that didn't work. And the way Leanna works, I like things that are effective. I like things that actually work, as opposed to just being thought purity or moral purity. And if you can't get people on board with a system because the system makes them feel guilt and shame, well, it's not a very good system, especially when the system is supposed to be, guiding men away from guilt and shame connected to any emotion but anger and asking for help. too many guys feel alienated by the whole toxic masculinity thing. So we have to find another way. And I'm totally fine with no horse in this race of saying this is general human shittiness, and it manifests differently in men and it manifests differently in women, and the rest of us are all like fucking ping pong balls just pulled between the two extremes and go, what is going on? And then the people who are actually masculine identity but assigned female at birth, or feminine identity and assigned male at birth, like, oh my God, like the whole system is toxic for everybody. It's making everyone miserable and less healthy. So let's look at the whole fucking elephant, okay? And this was part of what inspired this. I was talking to somebody who's really, really smart. And he was telling me about these toxic masculinity tests and how a bunch of him and his friends took these tests, and, the results went goofy for people who were not straight cisgender men. And I'm like, that's interesting. Bad data suggests something wrong with system. We do not ignore data. We re-examine the system. We don't ignore data. Leanna loves data, even if it's difficult, even when you call it data. Because something seem off, check, right? Because it's much easier to argue with your model than to argue with observations. There could be something wrong with the measuring tool, but again, that's your system, right? And I looked into it, and yeah, first of all, the wording of these toxic masculinity test questions is fucking awful. When you do the ambivalent sex inventory questionnaires, some are better than others. Often the questions are worded in a way where if you answer them honestly and literally, you end up getting bad points just because you were honest about a temptation or an urge, as opposed to your ability to challenge and resist that thought, which is where the guilt and shame come in. Like, if this is how people are talking about masculine social programming, because that's what it is. Let's face it. It's masculine social programming that it is anti-individual social programming. The idea that you are this thing that is part of the greater whole, and so you have a role based on this thing. And society wants to cram everyone into this thing because society likes predictability and tends to fear what is different. That's what's going on here, right? And when we start talking about things like, male disposability with military service and dying for your country or dying for a cause or working yourself to the bone and all that stuff, well, women are basically told you have to partner off, have children, then live for your children and sacrifice everything for your kids, right? And so we have disposability on both ends, and then people start fighting about which disposability is more disposable, and that goes freaking nowhere. Nowhere, because you're talking about the trunk of the elephant again. Look at the whole elephant, okay? A very short life versus a life that's completely self-sacrificing, and there are no choices, and women are discouraged from a full range of emotions as well as men. And this is the other thing I have issues with the whole toxic masculinity thing. Toxic masculinity theory focuses on the fact that the only emotion that is acceptable for a man to show is anger. Now, toxic femininity is the other way, that any anger in women is punished, usually by other women. Now, hear me out. Don't react right away. I understand that statement may ironically make you angry, because more and more anger in anyone is seen as a bad thing. And you get highly manipulative people using that to manipulate others. Everybody, right? My whole life, people have tried to put me in boxes where I don't fit. And instead of letting me define my experience, other people have told me what I am. And if you want to make Leanna angry, tell her that you know who and what she is better than she does. 'Cause you're probably wrong, you know? Occasionally someone has been right, and I cherish those people. But somebody who doesn't know me that well, you know, one thing that sets me off is I understand you're angry. It's a platitude. Because I probably, usually I'm not angry in those moments. I'm speaking loudly because, believe it or not, I was a really shy, quiet kid. I know, right? This is training. And a lot of it is theater training. And in theater, we were trained, if you start feeling nervous, if you start feeling scared, speak louder to stop, because I'd get up on stage and I'd talk like this. I talk into my chin because I didn't want, and nobody can fucking hear you, right? So the habit formed of the more nervous I get, the more scared I get, the louder I get. And so people think I'm yelling, and I'm not. I'm just, oh my God, I'm really uncomfortable and I don't want to start talking like this. So I talk like this. Drives me nuts when people assume that just because I'm talking loudly and speaking passionately about something, again, it's performance, right? People want to show. People don't want to watch videos from someone who is boring. So yeah, I'd be very demonstrative. That doesn't mean I'm angry. It means this is just the way I talk with my hands, you know? Again, body movement, right? I build characters that way. How does the character move? Because if it's just how the character thinks, well, right. Every character has to move and feel and perform differently when you're playing multiple characters yourself. So each of those characters seems like a different person. And so when you're getting back into the headspace of the character, it's a back and forth, you know, moving a certain way really does change how you think about the character. And I'm avoiding this again, but I'm not, because anger is okay. It's inappropriate anger or false anger that is the issue. And so when we associate any anger with a toxic masculine state, that isn't solving the problem. That's just changing the problem. It's pushing the problem from the so-called toxic masculine sphere, not into a place of healthy emotional balance. It's just pushing it into the toxic feminine sphere, where no one is ever allowed to be angry ever, because that's an inconvenience for other people. And, unfortunately, toxic femininity, if I were to define it, it's that state of perpetual childhood that women are treated as, like sort of half kids who have to be provided for and cared for and aren't really responsible for what they do. And of course, the whole phrase, children should be seen and not heard, moves over to women as well in a diluted way. That's basically how I define toxic femininity. You never own your shit, so you're constantly in the shit. But if you look at toxic masculinity, it's essentially the same thing, right? If you avoid acknowledging or being aware of emotions other than anger, you're not truly owning your shit. And so again, it's general human shittiness. But when we measure toxic masculinity the way we do as a specific thing, right? First of all, we treat men as the only people who are truly human beings, fully formed human beings, because we, unfortunately, too much feminist thought either ignores the heteronormativity, cisgender normativity, and homophobia among women as, oh, that's just the patriarchy. Well, okay, but so's the toxic masculinity shit. And the vast majority of men don't have any power in patriarchal structures. It's a minority of men controlling everything, not all men. But the interesting thing about the whole toxic masculinity thing is, if you do the test, if you look at the theory, it actually punishes gender nonconforming or transgender people and not straight people for that internalized self-doubt that society pushes on us. And I actually said us. Oh, I identified with that. Interesting. Okay. That you feel bad about being wired wrong, right? And everybody goes through this because it's not the norm. Deviating from the norm, especially the way structures like high school work, where conforming is survival in a lot of ways, especially in heavily rule-oriented environments that don't cherish the individual. Gender nonconforming and same-sex attracted people do tend to be the worst homophobes, the worst enforcers of gender norms, because they're trying desperately to fit in. And so when you ask a question on, a toxic masculinity questionnaire, have you ever used, a homophobic slur? Have you ever mocked somebody for not conforming to gender norms? Well, the only honest answer is yes, because everybody's done that at some point. The Ontario Liberal Party dumped a candidate in the elections that are going on right now because they posted a gay slur on Facebook when they were 13 years old. 13. You're holding an adult accountable for something they did when they were 13. That's insane. Like, talk about toxic. Talk about toxic. There's stuff coming up on It's Not Therapy this week about encouraging people to admit, acknowledge, and learn from mistakes. And that means mistakes don't have to be dire. 13. You want to drive a non-conforming person into guilt, shame, and general human shittiness? Up the shame. Up the idea that you will be punished forever for transgressions. Trust me, in the mind of somebody who's struggling with their sexuality or their gender identity, all transgressions feel the same, and that creates a lot of self-blame and a lot of anger because they're struggling, and a lot of deceptiveness. And that's another major thing. The things toxic masculinity tests tend to measure are deceitfulness and arrogance, anger, anger, it's just trait anger, heteronormativity, and homophobia. And when you are not the norm, you do go through a period of not just lying to other people and really pathetically trying to fit in, but you lie to yourself because you don't want to have those conversations, right? And when we look at the total picture, we see this sphere of human experience where everyone has something society makes them feel they have to lie about because of those punitive norms that Michel Foucault talks about. And the fact that Foucault was a gay man, I think, really informs his theories. I remember this wonderful friend of mine. He was I forget what his actual program was, sociology, I think. He was a semiotics guy, but he said, I remember the day I discovered Michel Foucault was gay, and everything made sense. It's like, yeah, okay, I love you, man. But anything we could pull out of toxic masculinity theory, I can apply to every other kind of person and show you how it wrecks them too. It's not being angry all the time that's the problem. It's why you're angry all the time. Because, I mean, let me tell you, there are a lot of women in the US right now, and a lot of people with women, and then some other people. I actually have a friend, he's a gay guy. He is furious every day about what's going on with Roe versus Wade. Is that an indication of toxic masculinity? No, sometimes the world is just angering, right? And of course, if someone's not talking about their feelings, if someone's not getting it out, if someone is not being their authentic self and an individual and being accepted for that, they are going to walk around angry, and they are not going to tell you the truth, and they're going to lash out at other people just because they can. But the core of it is that lack of authenticity. And that's really what toxic masculinity is getting at. But we don't need to use the gendered language to talk about it, because women got their own shit that way. I already talked about it. I won't go down that way. And that's what I mean about victim blaming and shaming and actually making the toxicity worse. Because if you create this system that is trying to shame, in this case, men, out of being ashamed of their feelings, well, what's that going to do, right? It's just going to create more shame, right? Everyone has elements of themselves that are deceitful. Why? Because we don't have complete self-awareness. And a little bit of arrogance, slightly too much arrogance, I believe, is better than not enough. Because if you're a little bit arrogant, you try things and fail. If you have a lack of confidence, well, then there's constant reasons to not try. So if you're going to err one way or the other, confidence, arrogance, hard to tell. The problem with the whole toxic masculinity thing is that it's basically based on a collection of thought crimes, as opposed to identify thought, identify behavior, challenge thought, apply self-compassion, become a less shitty human. It encourages men to call out each other, which, let's face it, is a form of aggression in itself, right? Instead of going, why'd you do that? And creating a space for conversation where we'll go, hey man, not cool. Like, you don't know what that person was going through that day. You don't know what they're struggling with. That instant judgment doesn't make anybody more inclined to talk to you. And this is the thing I find so weird about the internet in general. That people engage in human shittiness in my direction and then want a venue to talk about their sensitive, squishy bits. And anybody who's come at me on that way on Twitter knows you get an answer from me going, no. You don't come at me, call me a whole bunch of names and call me out and then expect me to give you a hearing about your more sensitive struggles. No. Me human too. And people think that's bitchy. People think that's aggressive. What that is saying, no, treat other people the way you want to be treated. If what you really want to do here is talk about how much you're hurting, don't start off on the attack. Like, just don't. Because no one with a healthy sense of self rewards that kind of behavior. And the problem is, people are probably thinking, yeah, that's what feminists do to me. That's what all these different activists do to me because I'm a white, straight, cisgender male, or at least they think I am. And, you know, I have a friend because he uses his sketches as profile pictures, and some of them are of women. People think he's a woman. And you should see the people who jump on him for being female all the time. And he's like, why do people do that? I'm like, well, I find this highly amusing. And all the data points to this is general human shittiness that a lot of people do, no matter what what it looks like. And we've just put a different label on every group. Apparently, with black men, it's called John Henryism. It's a subset of toxic masculinity. I had never heard that term before, and I was like, "What? Why are they dumping on Steel from Superman?" Because that was my point of reference. No, apparently John Henry is a historical figure. I learned something, but I do think that it doesn't encourage men to come out of the really oppressive gender box if you're slapping a term on them that enforces the gender box in any way. Because at the end of the day, people, yes, we sort of understand that there are masculine norms and feminine norms. We all know that. And Lord knows I know that because I still... Certain friends laugh at me because I cannot grasp certain social codes. Maybe that's why I get along with people on the autism spectrum so much, because I just like, what is this thing? What is, because I like old stuff. I like old literature and, you know, old art, and the masculine norms in the wartime era, like World War I to World War II, aren't even the same as the masculine norms post-Vietnam. And they're certainly not the same as the pre-war period, you know, when the Victorian fop was a legit thing, right? You know, go back when men wore lace cuffs and powdered wigs and talk to them about modern masculinity standards. They're like, well, that's just, that's just lacking class. That's lacking style. Right. And then you go back to the Greeks and Romans and they've got different paradigms completely. That is the socially constructed element, right? The fact that some people are more an identity or less of an identity based on behaviors and performance, as opposed to allowing people to go, okay, yes, these are our feminine norms and these are our masculine norms, but you know what? It's okay for people to play with them. It's also okay for people to have an identity that doesn't match how we label their body, because it's all part of the same thing, right? And I know why I have issues understanding this stuff, because I'm sure if I had a brain that was one way or the other, it would make a lot more sense to me, but I don't. And that's very real to me. So I'm like, yeah, okay, this makes sense. Other people who are comfortably in, you know, cisgender brain territory have a lot more trouble with this stuff. And this is why I say privilege is not an advantage, because privileges make you lazy. Privileges make you less good in the long run, because you're allowed too many comfortable assumptions that don't help you see the bigger picture. It's the trunk of the elephant. And that's why my takes on these things are so doesn't fit anywhere, right? And I'm glad that there are some people that watch these videos just to see me explore these concepts, because, yeah, I admit my hilarious floundering amuses me even sometimes. But my floundering with this stuff is why I understand other people's floundering with this stuff. And so, my hot take, I'm not going to use the term toxic masculinity anymore because I actually think the entire paradigm is bullshit. If we want men to step out of the constructions associated with masculinity and be individuals, we have to not enforce constructs of masculinity one way or the other. And there will always be a norm, but we can make those norms less punitive, right? We can make iconoclasm a more desired trait. And here's where I'll leave to give you a little carrot to drop these norms. The greatest periods of human advancement have also come when eccentricities were far more tolerated. And this is true of any culture. There's these huge bursts of creativity when people are just allowed to be their authentic selves. Now, we have never had a point where that was like 100%, so we can't measure along those ways. But it is interesting food for thought. But yeah, who else wants to just join me and replace the whole idea of toxic masculinity with this affects us all? It's general human shittiness. All of these punitive norms are a problem. And that's what toxic masculinity is. It's men struggling under punitive social norms that encourage general human shittiness with a gendered coat of paint. Interested in what you guys are going to do with this? Help support this channel. Become a monthly patron. Patreon.com/LeannaK, or buy a one-time coffee Leanna Care session for someone who can't afford it. Coffee.com/LeannaK. Thanks for watching Manly Mondays.